My cabin sits on the edge of an emerald sea of pine trees, perched high on a ridge where the wind sings its constant, restless tune. There's a subtle magic to this place. Something in the way the sunlight pierces through the forest canopy and dances on the underbrush. Yet, even in all its beauty, the park has its dangers, and as a ranger, I've made it my life's mission to protect this wilderness and those who venture into it. I stretched in the pre-dawn light, feeling the comforting ache of a body well used to work. The smell of coffee wafted through the cabin, mingling with the scent of pine, resin, and earth. Today, like every other, would start with a patrol, a solitary trek into the forest, a walk that never failed to remind me why I'd chosen this life. After lacing up my boots and securing my gear, a sturdy pack with essentials like a map, a first aid kit, and my trusty field journal, I stepped outside. The air was crisp, and my breath came in little clouds. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the trees in shades of orange and gold. A soft crunching sound underfoot accompanied my every step as I made my way to the trailhead. They call this place Elk Hollow National Park, though I haven't seen an elk here in years. Poaching and habitat loss drove them deeper into the mountains long before I came. Still, the name sticks, a bittersweet reminder of what once was. I'm the only full-time ranger stationed here, which suits me fine. The solitude is a balm, though it does have its quirks. You learn to recognize every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the woods. You learn the difference between a harmless breeze and the ominous silence that signals something's wrong. Today, the woods felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first. No broken branches or trampled brush. No unusual tracks in the dirt. But I've been here long enough to trust my instincts, and they were whispering that something was out of place. About an hour into my patrol, I found the first sign. It was a clearing I knew well, a favorite spot for black bears to forage for berries. But today it was different. The bushes were stripped bare, their branches broken and clawed at. Nearby, the ground was churned up, as though some kind of scuffle had taken place. I knelt, studying the scene. The tracks were messy but distinct enough. They weren't bear tracks, though. They were human, poachers. My jaw tightened. I'd had run-ins with them before, though not often. Elk Hollow was remote and rugged, not the kind of place most people ventured into without good reason. But poachers weren't most people. They were opportunists, the kind who cared little for the lives they disrupted, be it animal or human. As I stood and scanned the area, I noticed something else. A strange metallic glint from a nearby bush. I approached cautiously, pushing the branches aside to reveal a spent cartridge. The caliber was large, likely used for big game hunting. My stomach sank. Poachers were one thing, but if they were hunting animals as large as moose or bears, it meant they were either reckless, desperate, or both. I pocketed the cartridge, noting the exact location in my journal, and pressed on. I'd need to report this to the central office later, though I didn't have much hope for immediate action. Resources were always stretched thin, and Elk Hollow was low on the priority list. By midday, the sky had clouded over, and a light drizzle began to fall. I pulled my hood up and continued along the ridge, my eyes scanning for more signs of trouble. The trail wound its way through dense forest, occasionally opening up to breathtaking vistas of the valley below. It was during one of these moments, as I paused to take in the view, that I spotted it. Smoke rising in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of Blackthorn Gorge, a remote area rarely visited by tourists. If someone was out there, it wasn't for a casual hike. I tightened the straps on my pack and adjusted my pace, quickening my steps as the drizzle turned into a steady rain. My radio crackled to life just as I reached the gorge's edge, a static-filled reminder of my tenuous connection to the outside world. "This is Ranger 42, I said, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. "I've got signs of unauthorized activity near Blackthorn Gorge. Investigating further." The response was garbled, the words drowned out by static. I sighed and clipped the radio back to my belt. This was why I preferred solitude. Less chance for technology to fail when there's no one else to rely on. As I descended into the gorge, the smoke grew thicker, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning wood. My hand hovered near the radio again, but I hesitated. Something told me I'd find more answers if I moved quietly. The gorge was a labyrinth of jagged rocks and dense undergrowth. Even with years of experience, navigating it was a challenge. I moved carefully, keeping low and quiet, each step a deliberate decision. The smoke grew heavier, its bitter tang mingling with the earthy scent of wet leaves. My gut told me I was walking into something dangerous, but curiosity and duty drove me forward. Blackthorn Gorge wasn't just remote, it was notorious. Local legends spoke of strange sightings here, lights flickering between the trees, unearthly sounds carried on the wind. Of course, most of that was just folklore, the kind of stories that sprout in lonely places. But every legend has a seed of truth. As I crept closer to the source of the smoke, I began to hear voices. At first, they were faint. A murmur carried on the breeze. I stopped, crouching behind a fallen log, straining to catch the words. There were at least 2 speakers, their tones sharp and hurried. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tension in their voices was clear. Peering over the log, I spotted the source of the smoke. A makeshift camp nestled in a small clearing. A tarp was strung between 2 trees, sheltering a collection of supplies, boxes, tools, and what looked like bags of dried meat. A fire burned low in a pit, its flames licking at a blackened pot. The 2 men were standing near the edge of the camp, rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them, tall and wiry, gestured emphatically toward the treeline. The other, stockier with a scruffy beard, nodded, his expression grim. Both were dressed in camouflage, their clothes muddy and worn. I pulled out my binoculars for a closer look. My heart sank when I noticed the crates stamped with faded markings. Government issued. They'd raided one of our supply depots. That explained the high-caliber ammunition I'd found earlier. I needed to get closer, to gather more information before making my next move. Slowly, I circled the clearing, keeping to the shadows. The rain had softened the ground, muffling my footsteps, but I was painfully aware of how exposed I'd be if they spotted me. As I neared the edge of the camp, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. A large pile of animal pelts, crudely skinned and left to dry. Bears, wolves, and even a mountain lion. These men weren't just poachers. They were slaughtering indiscriminately. The stocky man spoke again, louder this time. "We can't stay here much longer. That ranger's been sniffing around." The other man scoffed. "Relax. This place is miles from her patrol routes. Besides, what's she gonna do? Call for backup? By the time anyone shows up, we'll be gone." I felt a flash of anger at his words, but I forced myself to stay calm. They didn't know I was already here. That gave me the advantage, at least for now. I backed away, retracing my steps until I was far enough from the camp to risk using my radio. Pressing the button, I whispered, "Ranger 42 reporting. Confirmed illegal poaching activity near Blackthorn Gorge. 2 individuals armed and dangerous. Requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled in response, but the signal was too weak to get through. I cursed under my breath and considered my options. Confronting them alone was out of the question. They had the firepower and the numbers. My best bet was to keep an eye on them and wait for an opportunity to act, or for the rain to ease up so my radio could work. I decided to set up a temporary observation post about 50 yards from the camp. From there, I had a clear view of their activities without risking exposure. As the hours passed, I watched them move in and out of the clearing, their actions methodical. They were packing up, loading crates and bundles onto a small, beaten-down ATV parked under the tarp. Just as I was starting to think they'd be gone before I could get help, something changed. A third figure emerged from the woods, a tall man in a long, dark coat. He didn't carry a rifle, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved, confident, almost predatory. The poachers greeted him with a mixture of respect and wariness. The tall man spoke in a low voice, his words impossible to hear from my position, but whatever he said seemed to unnerve them. The stocky man hesitated, then handed over a small metal case. The tall man opened it, inspecting the contents before nodding in satisfaction. This wasn't just about poaching. Something much bigger was happening here. As dusk fell, the camp's firelight cast eerie shadows across the clearing. My patience was wearing thin. I knew I couldn't let them leave with whatever was in that case. But without backup, the odds were stacked against me. Suddenly, a noise behind me made me freeze. A low growl, deep and guttural. Slowly, I turned my head, and my breath caught in my throat. A wolf stood less than 10 feet away, its eyes gleaming in the fading light. Its fur was matted, its body gaunt, but there was an intelligence in its gaze that made my pulse race. Wolves were rare in this part of the park, and they rarely approached humans. Something was very wrong. I held my ground, my hand moving instinctively toward the canister of bear spray on my belt. The wolf bared its teeth but didn't advance. Instead, it let out another growl, this one almost warning. Before I could react, the wolf turned and darted into the underbrush, its movements swift and deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to follow, and against all logic, I did. The wolf moved like a shadow, slipping through the trees with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. I struggled to keep up, branches whipping at my arms and face as I followed its trail. Rain slicked the ground, turning every step into a gamble, but the wolf didn't falter. It paused occasionally, glancing back at me with those piercing eyes before darting forward again. I couldn't explain why I trusted it, but something in the way it moved, intentional, purposeful, kept me chasing. It was leading me somewhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that wherever that was, it held answers. The forest thickened, the undergrowth swallowing the faint light from the sky. The air grew heavier, carrying an almost electric charge that prickled at my skin. Finally, the wolf stopped at the edge of a clearing, its ears twitching as it listened to the sounds of the forest. I crouched low, my breath shallow, as I took in the scene before me. At first glance, the clearing appeared unremarkable, a ring of tall pines surrounding a patch of open ground. But in the center stood something that didn't belong, a jagged stone structure, half hidden by moss and vines. It looked ancient, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The wolf let out a low whine and padded closer to the structure, its movements cautious. I hesitated, my mind racing. What was this place? I'd patrolled these woods for years and never come across anything like it. As I stepped into the clearing, a sudden wave of vertigo washed over me. The air seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that I felt in my bones. I staggered, reaching out to steady myself against a tree. The wolf turned to look at me, its gaze almost reproachful. "I get it," I muttered under my breath, forcing myself to move closer. "I'm coming." The stone structure was taller than it had appeared from a distance, its surface weathered by time but still imposing. The symbols carved into it seemed to shift as I stared at them, their glow pulsing in time with the strange hum in the air. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold stone, and an image flashed in my mind, vivid and startling. A forest consumed by fire, animals fleeing in terror, and then a figure standing amidst the chaos, their face obscured but their presence undeniable. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me gasping for breath. "What the hell?" I whispered, pulling my hand back. The wolf whined again, drawing my attention to the base of the structure. There, partially buried in the dirt, was something metallic. I crouched down, brushing away the soil to reveal a small, intricately designed medallion. Its surface was engraved with the same shifting symbols as the stone. I slipped the medallion into my pocket, my heart pounding. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't something I could leave behind. Before I could process what I'd found, the sound of voices broke through the stillness. The poachers. They were moving through the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the clearing. My pulse quickened. If they found me here, I'd have no chance against them. The wolf growled low in its throat, its body tense as it watched the approaching lights. Then, without warning, it darted off into the woods, its movement so sudden I almost called out to it. But the voices were getting closer, and I couldn't risk making a sound. I ducked behind the stone structure, pressing myself against its rough surface as the poachers entered the clearing. There were 3 of them now, the wiry man, the stocky man, and the tall stranger in the dark coat. Their flashlights swept across the clearing, illuminating the stone structure and the surrounding trees. "This is it," the wiry man said, his voice tinged with unease. "This is where it happened." The tall man didn't respond. He walked to the center of the clearing, his movements deliberate, and placed a hand on the stone. His expression was unreadable, but there was something almost reverent in the way he touched it. "This place is older than you can imagine," he said finally, his voice low and measured, "and it holds power that you too can't begin to understand." The stocky man shifted uncomfortably. "We're just here for the job, all right? You said it'd be simple. Grab the goods, get paid. What's all this about?" The tall man turned to him, his eyes cold. "This is bigger than your petty schemes. The medallion was here, I'm certain of it. And we're not leaving until I have it." I instinctively touched my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of the medallion. My mind raced. They were looking for it, whatever it was, and I'd already taken it. The wiry man muttered something under his breath, but the tall man silenced him with a sharp glare. "Search the area," he ordered. "Now." Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay hidden for long, not with them combing the clearing. I needed a plan, and fast. My hand tightened around the canister of bear spray on my belt. It wasn't much, but it might buy me enough time to slip away. As the poachers spread out, I moved as quietly as I could, inching toward the edge of the clearing. Every step felt agonizingly loud, the sound of my boots crunching on the wet leaves amplified in my ears. I was almost to the tree-line when the wiry man's flashlight swept across my path. "Hey, over here!" The shout was like a gunshot, cutting through the air and sending my heart racing. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush as the poachers gave chase. The tall man's voice rang out behind me, cold and commanding. "Get her! Don't let her escape!" I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the small, cramped confines of my cabin, the medallion resting on the table in front of me. The strange symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift and shimmer under the dim light of the oil lamp. I couldn't look away, drawn in by the faint hum that resonated whenever I touched it. I flipped open my journal and began to jot down everything that had happened. The poachers, the stone structure, the wolf. My handwriting grew shaky as I described the medallion and the vision it had triggered. The fire, the figure, and that overwhelming sense of foreboding. The wolf's roll gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't normal behavior for an animal to lead a human, or to show such clear intent. And yet, it had saved me, twice. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. Whatever this medallion was, it was tied to something far bigger than I understood. I needed answers, and the park's archives seemed like a good place to start. The archives were housed in an old maintenance shed near the visitor center, a 15-minute drive from the cabin. I stuffed the medallion into my pocket, slung my pack over my shoulder, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening with dew. Birds called from the treetops, their songs a stark contrast to the tension coiled in my chest. As I climbed into the park's battered jeep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The archives were a mess of dusty shelves and unlabeled boxes, the kind of place where time itself seemed to have settled into the corners. I flicked on the overhead light, its fluorescent glow casting sharp shadows over the cluttered space. Pulling on a pair of gloves, I began sifting through the files, searching for anything that might shed light on the stone structure or the medallion. An hour passed, then two. Most of what I found was mundane: wildlife surveys, old maps, maintenance logs. But just as I was starting to lose hope, a folder tucked behind a row of binders caught my eye. It was labeled Blackthorn Gorge, Historical Anomalies. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside were yellowed pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and grainy photographs. The first few entries were from the 1970s, detailing unusual sightings in the area. Strange lights, unexplained sounds, and reports of hikers going missing. One photograph made my breath catch. It showed the same stone structure I'd seen in the clearing, though the image was blurred and grainy. Scrawled beneath it in faded ink were the words, "Gateway." The more I read, the more unsettling the entries became. The final pages of the folder were written by someone named Dr. Elias Greaves, a researcher who had apparently been studying the gorge in the 1980s. His notes were frantic, filled with references to energy fluctuations and temporal anomalies. One entry stood out. The symbols on the gateway resonate at a frequency beyond human perception. I believe they are meant to contain something, but the containment is weakening. If the medallion is removed, the consequences could be catastrophic. I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. The medallion. I reached into my pocket, pulling it out and holding it up to the light. Could this small, unassuming object really be the key to something so dangerous? A loud knock on the door snapped me out of my thoughts. My pulse jumped as I shoved the medallion back into my pocket and grabbed the nearest object, a rusted wrench as a makeshift weapon. "Ranger," a voice called. "You in there?" I relaxed slightly, recognizing the voice of Mark, one of the seasonal rangers who worked at the visitor center. Still, I kept the wrench in hand as I opened the door. Mark stood there, his rain jacket slick with dew. His usual easygoing expression was replaced with one of concern. "We've got a problem," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "A group of hikers reported seeing armed men near Blackthorn Gorge. I thought you should know." My blood ran cold. "When?" "Early this morning. They said the men were carrying rifles and crates, like they were moving something." He hesitated. "You don't think it's them?" I said grimly. "The poachers." I explained the situation to Mark in as much detail as I could without mentioning the medallion. His face grew paler with each word. "What do we do?" he asked. "I'll head back to the gorge," I said, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at my gut. "If they're still there, I'll call it in." Mark looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. Instead, he nodded. "Be careful out there." I nodded back, my mind already racing. If the poachers were still at the gorge, it meant they hadn't found what they were looking for. But if they caught me again, I wouldn't be so lucky. The drive to Blackthorn Gorge felt longer than usual, the Jeep's tires slipping on the muddy trails. I parked a good distance from the clearing and approached on foot, moving as quietly as I could. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife conspicuously absent. When I reached the gorge, the clearing was empty. The camp was gone, the fire pit cold and abandoned. But the stone structure still stood, its symbols glowing faintly in the overcast light. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't, not without knowing what was going on. The chanting grew louder as I followed the sound, leading me deeper into the forest. It had an otherworldly quality, each syllable resonating in my chest like the tolling of a distant bell. Finally, I reached another clearing, smaller than the first. And there they were. The poachers knelt in a circle around a fire, their rifles discarded in the grass. At the center of the circle stood the tall man in the dark coat, holding a large, leather-bound book. He was chanting, his voice rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. The medallion in my pocket grew warm, almost as if it were reacting to the sound. I gritted my teeth, my hand instinctively closing around it. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't just poaching anymore. This was something far darker. I stepped back, the weight of the medallion heavy in my pocket. I needed to stop this, whatever it was, before it was too late. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I crouched in the underbrush, trying to process what I was seeing. The poachers, stripped of their usual bravado, were now part of something far beyond simple greed or desperation. They knelt, heads bowed, swaying slightly in time with the tall man's chant. The rhythmic cadence filled the clearing, an ancient melody that felt as though it had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself. The medallion in my pocket pulsed like a second heartbeat, its heat spreading through the fabric of my jacket. My instincts screamed at me to run, to leave this nightmare behind and never look back. But the words in Dr. Greaves' notes echoed in my mind. If the medallion is removed, the consequences could be catastrophic. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling silence. The tall man stepped forward, his dark coat billowing in the faint breeze. He held the book in one hand and something else in the other, a knife with a jagged obsidian blade. Its edge seemed to shimmer unnaturally, as though it were cutting through more than just air. "The time has come," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the clearing. "The gateway must be opened." One of the poachers, the wiry man, shifted uneasily. "I thought we were just here for the artifacts," he muttered. "You never said anything about this." The tall man turned his cold gaze on him, and the wiry man fell silent. "Do you think the medallion is just a trinket?" the tall man said, his tone sharp. "It is the key to unlocking what lies beyond, and you will do as you're told." The stocky man glanced between the two, his face pale. "What lies beyond?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The tall man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Power, knowledge, the kind of wealth that transcends this world." I pressed my back against the nearest tree, my mind racing. Whatever ritual they were attempting, it centered on the medallion, and I had it. If they realized it was missing, it wouldn't take long for them to figure out where it had gone. As if on cue, the tall man raised the knife high above his head. The chanting resumed, louder and more insistent, the voices blending into a haunting harmony. The symbols on the medallion burned hotter, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden any longer. My hand tightened around the canister of bear spray on my belt. It was a pitiful weapon against a group of armed men, but it was better than nothing. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. I stepped out of the underbrush, my boots crunching against the damp ground. The sound cut through the chanting like a gunshot, and all heads turned toward me. The wiry man was the first to react, scrambling to his feet and reaching for his rifle. "Who the hell? Don't move!" I shouted, leveling the bear spray at him. "Drop it!" The wiry man froze, his hand hovering above the weapon. The stocky man and the tall man remained where they were, though the latter's eyes narrowed as they locked onto me. "Well, well," the tall man said, his voice calm despite the situation. "The ranger. I was wondering when you'd show up." "Step away from the fire," I commanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever you're doing here, it ends now." The tall man tilted his head, regarding me with an unsettling curiosity. "Do you even know what you're holding in your pocket?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "That medallion is far older than this forest. Older than any of us." "You mean this?" I reached into my pocket and pulled it out, holding it up for all to see. The symbols on its surface flared with a brilliant light, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The poachers recoiled, their fear palpable. The tall man's eyes gleamed with a mix of triumph and hunger. "Give it to me," he said, his voice taking on an edge of command. "You don't understand its power. You're meddling with forces you can't comprehend." "Maybe not," I said, taking a step back, "but I know enough to keep it out of your hands." The tall man's expression darkened. "You've made a grave mistake," he said, his tone icy. He raised the obsidian knife, and the chanting around him grew louder, more frenzied. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and a low rumble filled the air. I glanced at the poachers, hoping for some sign of dissent, but they were too far gone. Their eyes glazed with a mixture of fear and awe. The medallion in my hand grew unbearably hot, forcing me to grip it tighter to keep from dropping it. The tall man took a step closer. "Give it to me, Ranger, or I'll take it from you." "Stay back," I shouted, raising the bear spray. He didn't stop. I pressed the trigger, unleashing a jet of the noxious spray directly at his face. He stumbled, coughing and clawing at his eyes, but the rumbling only intensified. The fire in the center of the clearing roared to life, its flames twisting and writhing as though alive. The medallion pulsed in my hand, sending a jolt of energy up my arm. I staggered, the world around me blurring as a new vision flooded my mind. This time, the images were sharper, more vivid. I saw the stone structure again, its symbols glowing brightly as a rift opened before it, a swirling vortex of light and shadow. From the rift emerged something vast and formless, a presence that radiated malice and hunger. I heard voices, hundreds of them, screaming in terror. And then, just as quickly, the vision faded, leaving me gasping for breath. When I came back to myself, the clearing was chaos. The poachers were scrambling to escape, the stocky man shouting something about cursed ground. The tall man, still blinded from the spray, was groping for the knife he'd dropped. The medallion's glow intensified, and I realized with growing dread that the rift from my vision wasn't just a possibility. It was already starting to form. I didn't think, I just acted. Clutching the medallion, I sprinted toward the stone structure. The tall man shouted after me, his voice filled with rage, but I didn't stop. The symbols on the structure pulsed in time with the medallion, their light merging into a blinding glow as I pressed the medallion into a hollow at the base. The rumbling ceased instantly. The fire in the clearing flickered out, leaving behind a suffocating silence. And then, just as suddenly, everything went dark. When I woke, the world was still cloaked in darkness, though the kind that was absolute and unnatural. It pressed against me like a weight, wrapping the forest in an eerie silence. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was alive, dead, or trapped somewhere in between. Then the pain hit, sharp and insistent, radiating from my shoulder and ribs. My head throbbed as though I'd been struck by lightning. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my hands trembling as they brushed against damp earth. The medallion was gone. Panic surged through me as I patted my pockets, searching for it. But it wasn't there. I looked around, my vision adjusting to the faint, ghostly glow emanating from the stone structure nearby. The symbols, which had been blindingly bright moments ago, or what felt like moments ago, now flickered weakly, as though drained of their power. The clearing was empty. The poachers were gone, and so was the tall man. Only the aftermath of their chaos remained. The overturned earth, the remnants of the fire pit, and the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. My pulse quickened as I tried to piece together what had happened. The medallion wasn't far. I found it near the base of the structure, partially buried in the dirt. Its surface was dull, the symbols faded, as though it had exhausted itself. I picked it up, relief washing over me, but it was short-lived. The visions I'd seen earlier haunted me. The rift, the screaming voices, the presence that had threatened to emerge. I didn't know what the tall man had been trying to do, but I'd stopped it. For now, I slipped the medallion back into my pocket, determined not to lose it again. The forest felt wrong, its usual vibrancy replaced with an oppressive stillness. Even the birds, normally so quick to resume their songs after a disturbance, were silent. I needed answers. The archive files had given me a glimpse into the history of this place, but they weren't enough. There had to be more, something that could explain what I was dealing with. And if Dr. Greaves had studied the stone structure, perhaps he had left other records behind. Back at the Jeep, I radioed the park office. The signal crackled weakly, but I managed to get through to Mark. "Mark, it's me," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "I need you to pull everything we have on Blackthorn Gorge, especially anything related to a researcher named Dr. Elias Greaves." There was a pause. Then Mark's voice came through, tinged with confusion. "Greaves? That name's familiar. Didn't he go missing years ago?" "I think so," I said, "but his work might still be in the archives. I'm heading back to the cabin now. Let me know what you find." The drive back was uneventful, but the sense of unease lingered. My mind kept replaying the events in the clearing. The chanting, the medallion's glow, and the vision of the rift. The tall man's words echoed in my thoughts. "You don't understand its power." He wasn't wrong. I didn't understand it, but I knew enough to fear it. When I reached the cabin, the wolf was waiting for me. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its silver-gray fur gleaming faintly in the early morning light. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then it turned and began walking toward the forest, pausing to glance back at me. "You again?" I muttered, slinging my pack over my shoulder. "Where are you taking me this time?" The wolf didn't answer, of course, but I followed anyway. The wolf led me to a small, overgrown path I hadn't noticed before. It wound through the trees, the underbrush thick and uninviting. But the wolf moved with purpose, and I trusted its instincts more than my own. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into another clearing. This one was different from the others, smaller, more intimate. In the center stood a stone pedestal, weathered and cracked, its surface carved with the same strange symbols as the medallion and the structure. The wolf stopped near the pedestal, sitting back on its haunches as though waiting for me to act. I approached cautiously, the medallion in my hand. The pedestal's carvings seemed to shimmer faintly as I drew closer, responding to the medallion's presence. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Then, almost instinctively, I placed the medallion onto the pedestal. The effect was immediate. The symbols on the pedestal flared to life, casting a brilliant light that illuminated the clearing. The hum I'd felt earlier returned, stronger and more insistent, vibrating through the air. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the light faded, leaving behind only silence. The wolf let out a soft whine, its ears flicking toward the forest. It stood, gazing at me one last time before disappearing into the trees. I wanted to call after it, to ask it what all of this meant, but the words caught in my throat. When I looked back at the pedestal, the medallion was gone. I searched the clearing, my heart sinking. The pedestal, now inert, gave no indication of what had happened. The medallion had vanished, and with it, any hope I'd had of finding answers. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something new. A faint trail of light leading deeper into the forest, like a path waiting to be followed. I tightened the straps on my pack, my resolve hardening. Whatever this was, whatever lay at the end of that trail, I had to see it through. The forest had called me here for a reason, and I wasn't leaving until I understood why. The faint trail of light stretched out before me, a shimmering path weaving through the dense forest. It glowed softly, like moonlight trapped in the earth, and seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. The air around me was charged, carrying a faint hum that vibrated in my chest. I glanced back toward the clearing, half expecting the wolf to reappear, but it was gone. The pedestal stood silent, its once glowing symbols now lifeless. The medallion's disappearance weighed heavily on me, but the trail left no room for doubt. Whatever force had been guiding me, it wasn't finished yet. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the glowing path. The forest around me seemed to shift as I walked. The trees grew taller, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The air thickened, filled with a damp, earthy scent that clung to my skin. Even the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, faded into an eerie stillness. I kept moving, the trail winding deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was trying to hold me back. But the light never wavered, its soft glow a constant guide. After what felt like hours, the path led me to a massive tree, its gnarled trunk towering above the forest canopy. Its roots spread out like veins, weaving through the earth in intricate patterns. The glowing trail ended at the base of the tree, where a small, hollowed-out opening beckoned. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The opening was barely large enough for me to crawl through, and the darkness within was impenetrable. But there was no turning back. The answers I sought were inside. I crouched down, gripping the edges of the hollow for support, and crawled in. The passage was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls of the tree pressing in on me as I wriggled forward. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of decay. My flashlight flickered as I moved, casting erratic shadows that danced along the tunnel. Finally, the passage opened into a cavernous space. I stood, brushing dirt from my hands and knees, and shone the flashlight around. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with roots that glowed faintly, illuminating strange symbols carved into the wood. At the center stood a stone altar, its surface covered in moss and vines. And there, resting on the altar, was the medallion. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the hollow chamber. The medallion lay still, its symbols dim but unmistakable. As I reached out to take it, a voice echoed through the cavern, low and resonant. "You have come far, Ranger." I froze, my hand hovering above the medallion. The voice wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to emanate from the very walls around me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my attempt at firmness. "A guardian like you, one who has walked this path before." The roots lining the walls pulsed faintly, their glow intensifying as the voice continued. "The medallion you carry is a key, but it is also a burden. It binds you to this place, to its power. Do you understand what that means?" "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but I know it's dangerous. People are trying to use it for what, I don't know. But it's my job to stop them." The voice paused, as if considering my words. "The medallion is a tether to the gateway, a link between this world and the void beyond. It was meant to contain the rift, to seal it. But its power has been disturbed, and now the seal is weakening." The vision of the rift flashed through my mind again. The swirling vortex, the monstrous presence, the screaming voices. My chest tightened as the enormity of the situation sank in. "How do I stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To seal the rift, the medallion must be returned to its origin. The gateway must be closed from within." "From within," I repeated, dread creeping into my voice. "What does that mean?" The glow from the roots dimmed, the voice fading. "You will see. The path lies ahead, but the choice is yours. Take the medallion and decide if you have the strength to bear its weight." The cavern fell silent. I stared at the medallion, its dull surface reflecting the faint light of the chamber. My hand trembled as I picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through me. The symbols flickered weakly, as though responding to my touch. The voice's words echoed in my mind. "The choice is yours." There was no doubt in my mind that the tall man would return to the gateway. He wouldn't stop until he had the medallion, until he completed the ritual and unleashed whatever lay beyond the rift. I couldn't let that happen. But sealing the rift from within, what would that require of me? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I turned to leave the chamber, the medallion clutched tightly in my hand. The glowing roots pulsed one last time, illuminating another passage on the far side of the cavern. It was wider than the one I'd entered through, sloping gently upward, the path ahead. As I stepped into the passage, a sense of determination settled over me. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I couldn't turn back now. The forest had chosen me as its guardian, and I would see this through, no matter the cost. The passage leading out of the chamber was broader than the one I'd entered, its walls lined with roots that glowed faintly, casting pale, wavering light. The air grew cooler as I ascended, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the medallion in my pocket was pulling me down. The voice's final words replayed in my mind. "The choice is yours." It was a choice I didn't feel ready to make, but one I couldn't ignore. As the tunnel opened into the forest, the medallion began to pulse faintly, a rhythmic vibration that sent shivers through me. The glowing trail I'd followed earlier was gone, leaving only the dappled light of the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. The stillness had returned, the forest unnaturally quiet. I checked my watch, surprised to see that it was still working. Somehow, hours had passed since I'd entered the tree, though it felt like mere moments. My radio, however, was silent. No static, no faint crackle of Mark's voice. The weight of isolation pressed down on me. I traced my way back toward the clearing with the stone structure, hoping to find some clue about what to do next. As I approached, I could hear faint voices in the distance. I crouched low, moving carefully through the underbrush until the clearing came into view. The poachers were back. The wiry man and the stocky man stood near the edge of the clearing, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They looked tense, their eyes darting toward the center of the clearing where the tall man stood, speaking to someone I couldn't see. His dark coat billowed in the wind as he gestured toward the stone structure. I shifted position to get a better view, my breath catching when I saw who he was talking to. Mark. Mark looked terrified, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The tall man leaned in close, his voice carrying faintly on the wind. "Where is it?" he demanded. "The medallion. I know your ranger took it." Mark shook his head frantically. "I don't know anything about a medallion. I swear." The tall man straightened, his expression cold. "You're lying, but no matter. She'll come back here eventually. And when she does..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. My hands clenched into fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Mark had nothing to do with this, and yet they were using him as bait. I needed a plan. Carefully, I surveyed the clearing. The poachers were armed, but their attention was focused on Mark and the tall man. The stone structure was glowing faintly, its symbols flickering like embers. The air around it shimmered, as though the rift was still active or close to becoming so. The medallion in my pocket grew warmer, its pulse quickening as though responding to the gateway. My mind raced. If I could get closer to the structure, maybe I could use the medallion to stop the ritual once and for all. But doing so meant putting myself directly in their line of sight. My fingers brushed against the bear spray on my belt, the only weapon I had. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to create a distraction. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. I crept around the edge of the clearing, keeping low to avoid being seen. The tall man's voice carried over the distance, sharp and commanding. "She's out there somewhere," he said, turning to the wiry man. "Spread out. Find her." The wiry man nodded and started toward the tree-line, his rifle at the ready. I ducked behind a fallen log, my heart pounding as he passed within a few feet of me. He paused, scanning the forest, but then continued on, muttering under his breath. Once he was out of sight, I shifted my focus to the clearing. Mark was still near the center, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. The tall man stood near the structure, his hand resting on its surface as though drawing strength from it. I couldn't wait any longer. Gripping the bear spray tightly, I stepped out of the underbrush and shouted, "Hey!" The tall man turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he spotted me. "There you are," he said, a cold smile spreading across his face. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Let him go," I said, nodding toward Mark. "This is between you and me." He laughed, the sound low and menacing. "You think you understand what's happening here? You're meddling in forces far beyond your comprehension." "Maybe," I said, taking a step closer, "but I know enough to stop you." Before he could respond, I raised the bear spray and unleashed it in a sweeping arc. The tall man staggered back, coughing and clawing at his face. Mark took the opportunity to run, darting toward the tree-line as the poachers shouted in confusion. Chaos erupted. The stocky man raised his rifle, but before he could fire, I threw a rock at his head, striking him hard enough to make him stumble. The wiry man came rushing back, his weapon trained on me, but I ducked behind the stone structure, using it as cover. The medallion in my pocket flared to life, its heat searing through the fabric of my jacket. The symbols on the structure responded, glowing brightly as the air around it began to ripple. A low hum filled the clearing, growing louder with each passing second. The tall man straightened, his face twisted with rage. "You fool!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're destabilizing the gateway." I didn't have time to think. I pulled the medallion from my pocket and pressed it against the structure, the symbols on both aligning perfectly. The hum intensified, the ground shaking beneath my feet as the gateway began to open. A swirling vortex of light and shadow erupted from the center of the structure, its pull almost knocking me off my feet. The tall man screamed something I couldn't hear over the roar, his voice swallowed by the maelstrom. The poachers dropped their weapons and fled, their panic palpable. Mark appeared at the edge of the clearing, shouting my name, but his voice was faint and distant. The vortex's pull grew stronger, dragging loose debris into its depths. My grip on the medallion faltered, and for a moment I thought I would be pulled in as well. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vortex collapsed in on itself, leaving behind a deafening silence. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The stone structure stood dark and lifeless, its symbols extinguished. The medallion was gone, its weight no longer in my pocket. Mark rushed over, his face pale but relieved. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping me to my feet. I nodded, though my body trembled with exhaustion. "It's over," I said, more to myself than to him. "At least, I think it is." But as I looked back at the stone structure, a flicker of unease crept into my chest. The forest had grown quiet again, the kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. The gateway was closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the end. The walk back to the cabin felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Every step was heavy, my body aching from the strain of the day. Mark stayed close, his worried glances reminding me of just how shaken he was. Neither of us spoke as we moved through the forest, the silence between us filled with unspoken questions. When we finally reached the cabin, I collapsed into one of the chairs, my head in my hands. The events of the clearing replayed in my mind. The vortex, the medallion's disappearance, the tall man's enraged screams. Despite the gateway's apparent closure, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Mark stood near the door, shifting uncomfortably. "What happened out there?" he asked finally. "What was all that stuff?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I don't know how to explain it," I said, my voice hoarse. "That man, whoever he was trying to open something. A gateway to, I don't even know what, and the medallion." I stopped, the words catching in my throat. "It was the key." Mark frowned. "But it's gone now, right? Whatever that thing was, you stopped it." "I hope so," I said, though the uncertainty in my voice was impossible to hide. The next few hours passed in a haze. Mark radioed for additional rangers to help secure the area, though neither of us mentioned the supernatural elements of what had happened. Instead, we focused on the poachers, their illegal activity providing a convenient, if incomplete, explanation for the chaos. By the time the sun began to set, the other rangers had arrived. Together, we combed through the forest, looking for signs of the poachers or the tall man, but they had vanished without a trace. The stone structure in the clearing was inert, its once glowing symbols faded into obscurity. It looked ancient and harmless, as though it had been abandoned for centuries. But I knew better. Later that night, I sat alone in the cabin, staring at the small fire crackling in the hearth. The weight of the medallion was gone, but its absence felt heavier than its presence ever had. My thoughts wandered to the voice I'd heard in the chamber, its cryptic warnings and insistence that the choice was mine. Had I made the right decision? The sound of footsteps outside snapped me out of my thoughts. I stood, reaching for the flashlight on the table, and moved cautiously to the door. When I opened it, I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. The wolf was back. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its silver-gray fur glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of calm. It was as though the wolf was trying to communicate, though not with words. "Is it over?" I asked softly, unsure if I was speaking to the wolf or myself. The wolf tilted its head, its gaze steady but unreadable. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I didn't follow. Instead, I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness where the wolf had been. It felt like a goodbye, but whether it was the end of the journey or the beginning of something new, I couldn't say. The following days were a blur of reports and investigations. The rangers found traces of the poachers' camp, including spent cartridges and empty crates, but nothing to explain the otherworldly phenomena. Mark kept his distance, though his occasional glances told me he hadn't forgotten what he'd seen. As for me, I threw myself back into my work, patrolling the forest with a renewed sense of purpose. Elk Hollow was more than just a park. It was a living, breathing entity, and I was its guardian. The medallion may have been gone, but its legacy lingered. One morning, as I walked the familiar trails near Blackthorn Gorge, I felt a faint hum beneath my feet. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I paused, listening to the forest around me. The birds were singing, the wind rustling through the trees. Everything seemed normal, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I tightened the straps on my pack and continued walking, my eyes scanning the forest for anything out of place. The gateway was closed, but I knew the forest's secrets were far from fully revealed. The ranger's watch never truly ended. The seasons changed slowly in Elk Hollow. Spring gave way to summer, and summer to the crisp chill of autumn. The forest remained as breathtaking as ever, its endless expanse of pines and rugged cliffs a testament to the enduring beauty of the natural world. Yet, beneath that beauty, I felt the faint tremors of something more, something alive and ancient. The gateway had been sealed, but the forest hadn't forgotten. I resumed my patrols, each day blending into the next. Mark transferred out of Elk Hollow a few months after the incident, his departure quiet but not surprising. He'd seen things that defied explanation, and I couldn't blame him for wanting to leave them behind. The other rangers came and went, oblivious to the truths buried deep within the park. But I stayed. One evening, as I prepared to close up the cabin for the night, a package arrived. It was unmarked, delivered by one of the seasonal rangers who found it at the park's main office. The box was small and heavy, wrapped in plain brown paper. A sense of unease settled over me as I set it on the table, staring at it for a long moment before tearing away the wrapping. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked with age. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling as I recognized the handwriting on the first page. Dr. Elias Greaves. The journal was filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and maps. Greaves had documented years of research into Blackthorn Gorge and the surrounding forest, his findings both fascinating and horrifying. He described the gateway in intricate detail, its symbols and structure designed to hold back a force he referred to only as the presence. The medallion is the anchor, one entry read. Without it, the seal will falter, and the presence will stir. Cannot be destroyed, only contained. I turned the pages slowly, absorbing every word. Greaves had known about the dangers of the gateway, but he'd also believed in the forest's ability to heal itself. The forest is alive, he wrote. It is both guardian and prisoner, a force of nature that must be respected and feared. At the back of the journal, I found a folded map marked with hand-drawn symbols. One location was circled, deep within a part of the forest I'd never explored. Next to it, in bold letters, Greaves had written, "Sanctuary." My pulse quickened as I studied the map. Greaves had intended to return to the sanctuary, to learn more about the forest and its connection to the gateway. But he'd disappeared before he could finish his work. I folded the map and slipped it into my pocket, my mind racing. The forest had chosen me as its guardian, just as it had chosen Greaves before me. Whatever sanctuary he had found, it might hold the answers I still sought. The next morning, I packed my gear and set out early, the map tucked securely in my jacket. The trail was long and unfamiliar, winding through parts of Elk Hollow that felt untouched by time. The trees here were ancient, their trunks covered in thick moss and their branches heavy with the weight of centuries. As I followed the map, the forest seemed to guide me, its rhythms aligning with my steps. The hum I'd felt near the gateway returned, faint but persistent, a reminder of the power that lay hidden beneath the surface. By late afternoon, I reached the marked location. It was a small glade, surrounded by towering pines and bathed in golden light. At its center stood a stone circle, its surface etched with symbols similar to those on the medallion. Unlike the gateway, these symbols pulsed with a gentle, calming energy. I stepped into the circle, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The air here was different, lighter, cleaner. It was as though the forest itself was watching, waiting to see what I would do. I opened Greaves' journal, flipping to the last entry. His final words struck a chord deep within me. The gateway is a wound, but the forest is its salve. If we listen, it will teach us how to protect it. The medallion is not the end. It is the beginning. I knelt in the circle, closing my eyes and letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. The hum grew stronger, resonating in my chest, and for the first time, I felt a sense of connection to something far greater than myself. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, one that had chosen me as its steward. When I opened my eyes, the symbols on the stones glowed faintly, their light warm and reassuring. The medallion might have been gone, but its purpose remained, and so did mine. I returned to the cabin that evening, exhausted but determined. The forest had given me a new path, one that would require patience, vigilance, and trust. The secrets of Elk Hollow were far from fully revealed, but I no longer feared them. I had become part of the forest, its guardian in every sense of the word. The ranger's watch never truly ended, but now I understood why.